Welcome to the stage, Her Royal Highness Crown Princess Mary of Denmark.
Good morning, everyone. Since the closing of Women Deliver in Copenhagen in 2016, I've been looking forward to this, the next Women Deliver conference. And it's not just the personal learning, inspiration, network building, and satisfaction that comes from participating. It is so much more. It is the feeling of being part of something much bigger than oneself, of being part of a movement, of the paradigm shift that our world wants and needs. And that is a world where everyone is equal in rights, freedom, choices, and opportunities. Of all the obstacles to achievement and exercise of human rights, few have proven to be as challenging to overcome as those based on gender. In UNFPA's latest State of the World Population Report, it is written that in virtually all societies, gender has been defined in ways that subordinate women to men by imbuing definitions of masculinity and femininity with different levels of power and social authority, forcing conformity to gender stereotypes and constraining the freedom of both women and men. The result of inequitable gender norms is the limits placed on the women and girls to freely make fundamental decisions affecting their own lives and their own futures. Gender norms, or social or cultural norms, are incredibly binding and incredibly difficult to change. Norms lock people into a social equilibrium, and only when enough people have been seen that enough people have seen that enough people are changing, can a new balance be found. And to do that, it requires a deep and respectful understanding of the dynamics that cement a norm in a society or within a group, and what sanctions hold it there. The first step to change is to try and understand why, and to not let one's judgment stand in the way. Only through true understanding can we develop effective solutions and interventions that can lead the way to social change, or in other words, real and sustainable change that comes from within. You could say that understanding the current state of the world has formed the basis for creation of the blueprint that aims to address the economic, social, and environmental dimensions of sustainable development. And that recognition of the challenges like poverty, climate change, inequality, and corruption affecting the state of the world has led 193 countries to negotiate, agree, and sign the 2030 Agenda, comprising, as we know, 17 goals, 169 targets, and 232 indicators. With such unified agreement to act comes accountability. Being responsible for what we do, but also for what we do not do. So how are regions, countries, companies, individuals accountable for delivery on the SDGs? And how can that accountability be measured? And how do we make accountability meaningful? These questions and many more, I'm sure that the panelists in a moment will explore and discuss in much more depth. But let me take a moment just to scratch the surface a little. Part of being accountable and taking responsibility is being able to argue convincingly for your actions and results, And to argue convincingly, we need more and better data. We need to be able to track progress to design and target interventions and investments to ensure that our actions are the right ones, and to substantiate the actions taken are producing positive results without adverse or unimagined, unintended consequences. Data gives us important insights that may otherwise go undetected. Data makes the invisible visible. If you cannot see it, you cannot fix it. Data can illustrate the link between multiple and intersecting factors. Data means powerful decisions, and powerful data can lead to strong progress. And we must ensure progress for women and girls. Our challenge, or more correctly put, our opportunity, is to overcome the deeply entrenched barriers that impede progress for women and girls. The SDGs hold that promise, and achieving greater gender equality is also seen as the best way to achieve progress for almost all the other goals. We have heard it said many a time, we can't close the gender gap without closing the data gap. Gaps in gender data and lack of trend data make it difficult to monitor progress for women and girls. And currently, data exists for only a small fraction of the indicators that were developed to assess progress on the 17 SDGs, including the more than 40 that directly relate to gender equality. And here I would like to acknowledge the work being done to help close this critical gap, something I'm sure the panel will also come to discuss. Are we succeeding in collecting relevant data? Is the process for data collection rinsed for gender biases? And can we be sure that the data, research, and evidence we have is being used effectively for policy making, scaling, and so on? Obviously, we need to do all we can to collect the right data so it reflects the lived reality of women and girls. And we must draw the right conclusions from that data so it can be felt in the lives of women and girls. As behind every piece of data is a human story and an opportunity to secure a life worth living for all. I cannot stress enough the need for more and better disaggregated data, solid evidence, and true accountability. Data and evidence are the foundation for effective policies, programs, and investments. We all know how difficult it is to move forward without knowing our starting point and without reliable data disaggregated by gender, age, and other diversity factors. It will be impossible to build the future on a solid foundation of knowledge. Data and evidence are how we illustrate challenges and opportunities to lawmakers, how we build interventions, and how we hold governments accountable. Commitments must include metrics so that we can track progress and evaluate the effectiveness of our strategies. Citizen advocacy is also crucial to making the numbers real and motivating decision makers to keep their promises. Measuring the progress of our implementation efforts is extremely complex, but the success of the 2030 Agenda is dependent on our ability to refine, redefine, redo, undo, and replicate. Dependent on our ability to adapt as we learn and to lead with wisdom and care. So we stay on track and ensure that the promises made become a reality in the lives of all women and girls, men and boys. The momentum that we built in Copenhagen has picked up speed and has grown in both reach and influence. We thought Women Deliver 2016 was pretty perfect, but this is, yeah, pretty cool. And I feel that there's the same sense of unity here as there was in 2016, but also an amplified energy and an intense sense of urgency. As Katja said yesterday in the opening, we cannot go backwards on gender equality and women's health and rights. And may I add a huge congratulations to the entire Women Deliver team. You have outdone yourselves yet again. This movement, why we are here, is the demand for a gender equal world, where no one is left behind, where we track our progress and plan better our future, where economies are strong, nations approach challenges together, and where our planet is more peaceful and in balance. There is no going back. It is wonderful to be here in Canada at Women Deliver, together here with all of you. And I'm thrilled to be part of this phase of the journey to deliver for women and girls. And I look forward to the day when girls and women have choice, not chance. And let's agree that less bad will never be good enough. Thank you.
Welcome to the stage our moderator and panel.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Julie Gishuru. I have an incredible panel with me this morning. Let me introduce them before I set the context. We have with us Alison Holder, Director of Equal Measures 2030, seated right next to me. And right next to her, we have Gabriela Ramos, Chief of Staff and Sherpa to the G7 and G20 at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. Next to her is a woman who needs very little introduction, known across the globe. It's Julia Gillard, Chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, and of course, the former Prime Minister of Australia. And right next to her, a warm welcome to the only man on this panel. We have Ephraim Kisangala, representing the Voice of Youth, and also a Women Deliver young leader. So, ladies and gentlemen, as we delve into the topic of the power of data and accountability, let's first recognize that data is not the most interesting of subjects, unless, of course, you are a numbers person. So we're going to try and do our best with this, but I feel really inspired by the words of the Crown Princess Mary of Denmark. She said, "Data makes the invisible visible." And with that in mind, we're going to look at the experiences and the knowledge of all the people on this panel as to what can we do better, what can we learn, what can we share. So Alison, I'll begin with you. Equal Measures has just launched a new index tracking gender equality across 129 countries, I believe it is. Maybe you could tell us, why is this important and how can we use data to drive impact, please?
Sure. Thanks, Julie. So I'm thrilled to launch the results of the Sdg Gender Index. It's been the product of over 2 years of work within the Equal Measures 2030 partnership, and we're so proud to have Women Deliver as one of those core partners who have built this index with us alongside others, including our national partners and others all around the world. What is the Sdg Gender Index? It's the most comprehensive tool available to monitor gender equality in 129 countries across 14 of the 17 SDGs and covering 51 crucial gender equality issues. It's a tool for advocates to hold governments accountable for the commitments they made in the SDGs, but it's also a tool that can inspire progress, help us celebrate progress. What did we find? Well, we found that 1.4 billion girls and women live in countries that get a very poor score on the index. We found that no country received an excellent score, and we found that every country has more to do to reach gender equality by 2030. So we are failing to deliver on the promises in the SDGs for literally billions of the world's girls and women. And the media coverage of the index yesterday, which went all around the world, it did paint quite a challenging picture. So no country will achieve gender equality by 2030. And I think we have to recognize the scale of that challenge, but I did also want to point out there's several hopeful and positive messages for me in the research that we've done. The first is that there are pockets of good progress and pockets of good news, even amongst those countries that struggle on the overall index. And an example is that several sub-Saharan African countries actually perform very well on the indicator that looks at whether women can rise to the very highest ranks of power in the government. And we actually heard about that on the panel yesterday, looking at Ethiopia and the recent changes that they've made. In fact, several sub-Saharan African countries outperform the OECD average, outperform the global average, and outperform several of the countries at the top of the index. So let's not focus only on the challenging messages. Let's look for those good news stories throughout the index, and that's why it's so important that we're able to break it down by different issues. The last one, in terms of hopeful messages, is if you look at the goals, the SDGs that countries perform strongest on overall, and that would be examples like hunger and nutrition, water and sanitation, education and health. Now, of course, there are so many things that still need to be done even within those agendas, but they are ones where we have dedicated attention, political will, funding, coordination over the period of the MDGs in the last 10, 20 years.
Thank you so much for that, Alison. And I do believe that the president of Ethiopia, Saleh Wakzauri, will be speaking after our two panels, which is excellent. Julia, let me come to you next. You know, it can get really alarming when you look at the information that we have. There's a lot of work to be done. From your perspective, how can leaders better use gender disaggregated data in making decisions and ensuring they are having impact?
Well, thank you for the question, and I'd like to congratulate Alison on the work that's been done to surface all of that information. It's truly fantastic. As someone who's held a leadership position as Prime Minister, you get a lot put at you. Your in tray is always bulging, and unless the gender issues are clearly surfaced in the data that you're getting, they're not going to get attention. So gender disaggregated data is just a foundation stone for policy makers. And it's a foundation stone for advocacy. Looking at the broad sweep of the work I do now, chairing the Global Partnership for Education, because I fundamentally believe that opportunity starts with educating a girl, and leading the Global Institute for Women's Leadership in London, I think it should end with women leaders. We need right across that pipeline to know what is happening right around the world in every nation so that we can adopt the best strategies for change. And some of the basic facts about how important education is, how poorly we're doing on women's leadership just aren't known and aren't shared. I do think we all need to recognise there are 130 million girls in our world who aren't in school, and yet we know that every extra year of schooling decreases a girl's chance of getting HIV/AIDS, to take just one example, by 6.7%. That if every mother can finish primary school, we would reduce maternal mortality by 2/3. We would save 190,000 lives a year. And if we're looking at women's leadership, if you think of a number in the mid-20s, then you're thinking of a number that represents the amount of female politicians we've got in the world today, the number of women who are senior managers, the number of women who are news media leaders, the number of women who are judges. If you think of a figure less than 20%, then you've got in your head the number of women who are corporate board directors. You have to think of a number less than 10%. 50%, to know the number of women who are senior IT leaders. Unless we bear down on those numbers and then research for the effective strategies for change and employ them, we won't see the degree of difference that we all aspire to. And in this world, where we've got so much to do, it would break my heart that $1 or a minute gets wasted on something that isn't moving those numbers in the right direction.
Thank you for that. And in a short while, I'll come back to you on some of the policies that you really think we should be working on and pushing for. Gabriella, let me come to your experience now. And you've been making a strong case, really pushing for us to use gender perspectives across all aspects of data. Why is this important? And in your opinion, how can stakeholders incorporate this into their operational DNA so that it's something that they do as a rule?
Let me start by saying, you said that data might be boring. I think data is powerful.
Okay,
just
great.
bringing the evidence, just putting there why we have a wage gap, why do we have a gap in terms of labor market participation, why do we have a gap of girls in STEM, why do we have a gap in terms of women in the digital world. I think this is the power of the story that data and the indicators can tell you. But I completely agree with the Prime Minister. I think that data is worth nothing if you don't use it for good policy making.
Right.
And this is the point, because we're trying to find the place in which this information, this evidence, can nurture better policies. And the OECD is the house of the good evidence, but it's also the house that is trying to promote better policy making among the member countries and the countries we work with. But it's also true with what Princess Mary said. It unveils this picture that we are in front and that suddenly somebody is not looking at. The women leadership, Prime Minister, you were in the G20, 1 out of 3 with Chancellor Merkel. You go and look at the composers, go and look at the directors of orchestra, go and look at the CEO. So this is the numbers that we need to be building up because it unveils the narrative that we need to put together, violence. But then data is also very powerful for something that I have been looking since I launched the gender strategy in the OECD, the benchmarking, inspiring, looking at countries that are doing the things right, because there is always one country that is doing something interesting in terms of policy making and benchmarking, and something that you can learn about it, and also to measure policies. Because that is good to tell you how the world is doing, but that is also good to tell you how the policies are changing the outlook. And I think this is very important. Let me tell you, for example, Korea just approved a dual parental leave, and they provide parents with 1 year, fathers. Nobody take that parental leave. So what can other countries tell Korea to do in terms of providing the incentives for those parents to take the parental leave is very important. The other aspect of how do we use data to advance the gender parity is in terms of building a narrative that does not only speak to women. I love you all, I love women, but we need to talk to leaders. And that's exactly what the OECD with Australia did in 2014 to build the economic narrative of how much countries were losing in economic power and productivity, in labor force participation, in the perspectives of diversity without allowing women to be part of their economies and really fulfilling the potential. Because governments have invested a lot in education of girls, and then you build all these obstacles building up in terms of how they can participate. The other part, talk to men, talk to boys. We are documenting the cost of toxic masculinities.
Right.
And we have it all over the place, even in very important presidents around the world. And we're also documenting the institutional and cultural barriers. All of these are data points, all of these are elements, but for decision making. If there is no decision making and change in the structure of the mindset and those that take decision, I don't think that data will work what is put in the table. But I feel that we're making a lot of progress.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Very, very powerful. Data, not for the sake of data, but obviously for the sake of impact. Speak to the different constituencies. So also have the narrative for leaders. They want to look at the economic impacts and bring our menfolk, our boys, into the story as well, and let's move together. Yep. Ephraim, that brings me to you, and really I want to start with the use of data in the work you've been doing. You do a lot of work in community healthcare. That's been your key area for a while now. How are you using data to drive strategy and to drive impact?
Thank you. It's nice that I'm coming last because I'll just build on what has already been said. There are just three basic things I would put that in. That the first thing is actually you observe, which is evidence, and you ask yourself why. And the third bit is attach a cost, or what do you lose if you don't go this direction. And I'll give it a simple illustration of like when I'm in hospital where I was working before getting to school. It's obvious, as it is in many other hospitals, that you have more women than men that come to hospital. In fact, they even attend more frequently the hospital compared to men. So after you've made that observation, you ask yourself, why is that happening? Now, of the so many reasons, the other can be satisfaction. Studies have showed that people are happier being treated by those they share things in common with. For example, an old person is happier to be attended to by somebody who is old. And the same happens with gender, happens with race. So after you've put that in mind, then you attach a cost. What cost comes in? What are the costs if you are having people coming so many times? If you are having a lady coming to hospital 5 times in a month. Now, every time anybody, be it a man, a child, a father, a mother, comes to hospital, there are a couple of things that happen. Number one is that there is a transport cost to it. Number two, you lose time that you could have either invested in working in your hospital, in your gardens or doing anything else. And three, there are medical bills to pay. So at the end of the day, if you put that together, you realize that those who go more frequently to hospital actually are having a bigger economic loss than the other people, than the rest. And that's why you come up and actually look at data and say, okay, if you want to push policy, you actually look at that cost. So the policymakers, when they look at that cost, it actually helps. It is a better convincing real language compared to just going and speaking and speaking and speaking. Okay. And so it is important that we invest, all the policymakers and all the stakeholders invest in having adequate number of health workers, both male and female. Of course, we know in the developing countries we are having fewer female health workers, so that you have an adequate number that the population, the different gender, are happy with to attend to them. Thank you.
Thank you. So that built your work around increasing the number of community health workers,
Definitely.
making people more comfortable with getting care from people they are familiar with. Yeah. Okay, I'll bring my next question to you as I come around this way now, Ephraim. If you were asked how we can better engage with data, what would your suggestions be?
I think the best way of engaging with data is still looking at having the three things I've said. When you really make a good observation and ask yourself that, because so many things look obvious, but it's until you get into the details of it that you actually understand what's happening. However, there is the other thing that really has to happen, that for us to really have better engagement with the data, we need to build capacity of the different people. Because we are having so many people that claim data is difficult, data is expensive, data and all sorts of things. So if we are having institutions, they really we should have different policymakers actually investing in having people in those different offices and organizations who love data and who are creative enough to simplify things. These days we are having people presenting data in form of infographics, in form of stories. In fact, stories are said to be data but hidden in words. So it is as simple as that. So we can translate all these things to make it easy for the people to understand.
Thank you so much. That is absolutely critical. Build capacity around data understanding and communication. And in many of our spaces, we do find that we have the data, and sometimes it's just not used because of that lack of capacity. So, Julia, let me come to you next. And I had mentioned policy changes that might be required for us to do things better, to use data more efficiently and effectively. What would you suggest?
I think it's very important that we concentrate on data at different levels. I mean, at the end of the day, I agree, data is powerful. It's about spurring change, and levels of activism are global, they're national, they're local, so we need data that can be broken down in that way, because I might be wanting to use my power as a community member to change something locally. I need to know what's happening. I might want to be using my power as a voter and an activist to change something within my nation. I might want to be advocating for a whole global shift. We need each of those pieces of information. And we've talked about the power of data to inspire, but I think there's the flip side of that, and that's the power of data to shame. And we shouldn't shy away from that. One of the reasons why it is good to have global moments, national moments, when we get new pieces of information, is that we can, yes, celebrate best practice and share it, but we can also put a spotlight on those who are falling behind, and we can then use our voice, whether it's our power as consumers or as voters or as activists, to put pressure on people who are refusing to shift and move. And if we look at today's world, I think that kind of activism, because of how interconnected we are, can be tremendously powerful. For example, in the United Kingdom, it's not perfect, but you do now get gender pay gap data by company. And that will be, it's come out 2 years now, and it obviously will get a longitudinal track, but out of that you will be able to see who had a gender pay gap and started to move and improve, and who had a big gender pay gap and apparently didn't care. And we should know that and mobilise our activism to force change.
Right, absolutely. The power to shame and force change through that as well. And so, Alison, it brings me to you. This is part of the importance of an index. Like you've been working so hard on this. I want to understand now, how do you then engage? So you have this amazing index, you have all this data. How do you then work with partners and other stakeholders to really ensure that you are using data in advocacy, for instance?
Yes, and the use of data is absolutely core to Equal Measures 2030 and the way we work. So this week we're talking a lot about our index, but actually a huge amount of what we spend our time and money doing is supporting local partners in, at the moment, 7 countries to help them to use data to fuel their activism. And that's a crucial part of our model. And so it's not enough to make an index. You absolutely need to carry it through to providing funding, resources, capacity to the local women's movements, who we know are so often at the forefront of change, and we really see this data as adding that extra little bit of fuel to their work. We did very much along the lines of what the Prime Minister talked about with the overflowing in trays. We did a survey of policymakers in 5 countries recently, and what was really clear is that, yeah, we have data gaps, there's issues we don't understand well enough, the disaggregation isn't there that we want, but actually on issues that we have very good data on, even those are not top of mind for policymakers. So we know very well how many women are in Parliament, and yet policymakers in our research weren't able to cite those statistics. They don't have gender data at the tips of their fingers in the same way that they do data about economic growth, for example. And so a tool like our index, we are going to work with every women's movement, every advocate, every champion from across sectors to take this data, take it to policymakers, take it again, repeat it, and make sure that it is as top of mind as data about GDP, for example.
Thank you for that. I'm going to move us backward a little bit, Gabriella, as I come to you with what is really still remains a critical question. What are the challenges we are facing still today in accessing data? And are there recommendations, policy recommendations maybe, that you would propose to address these?
I will repeat what we... Do I have the mic?
Yes, it's on.
Where you left it, the GDP. I feel that to really advance a meaningful agenda for gender equality, you need to change the way we measure economic success. If we continue measuring just by GDP per capita, what happened? Our growth model had delivered badly. It had delivered badly for the environment. It had delivered badly for inequalities, including gender. It had delivered badly for the financial stability and, all this concentration at the top. So I feel that we need to stop treasuring what we measure, the GDP and all these very complex numbers that finance ministers really look after, not to treasure what we measure, but to measure what we treasure.
Wow.
And to broaden this agenda and to get into the well-being of people, because what happens is that we are rowing against the tide. We are saying, okay, we need more women at the top of the CEO's business 500. Yeah, but companies are not rewarded if they go for diversity. You tell, oh yes, we need more women in the government sector, but that doesn't change if you don't really go for a people-centered growth measuring well-being. I think that's the most important part. The other part is that if you build up a more people-centered growth, then you will look at how policies impact women. And then it's not going to be a gender agenda. It's going to be an infrastructure agenda looking at the gender angle. It's going to be an environmental agenda looking at gender angle. Getting countries to do gender budgeting. You need full amount of data, but you also need to take away all these limits that you have in your brain in terms of really putting the gender angle. So the most difficult part is not the surveys, is not the technical issues. I can tell you the OECD has advanced a full amount of information. We're very proud of our Sdg database, which is this index that measures institutional and cultural norms that prevent women from advancing. We will continue providing all this data on education, on PISA, on health, on all these areas in which the OECD works. But the fact is that we need to make a meaningful connection of what people value and what we reward from the institutions to use those data to change the growth model that we have been following up to now.
Wow, so there's a quotable quote. Who's on Twitter or Instagram? Whatever you are on, you need to say, don't treasure what we measure,
but measure what we treasure. Yep. Measure what we treasure, don't treasure what we measure.
Thank you very much. So quote that, and it brings me back to you, Julia, as we talk about doing that, right? Treasuring what we are measuring and ensuring that we really put our issues front and center and make sure the data works and that it works for the impact. How do we leverage partnerships and work well with other stakeholders to do better in this work? And I think, with your experience both from government and outside of government, how do we actually do that?
Well, one of the great strengths of Women Deliver is that it brings so many people, so many women from around the world, and this is a great place to form partnerships. But in my view, as a former Prime Minister and as a policy maker, government has to be in partnership with the community and its representative organisations. At the end of the day, government does need activists to help make more political space, to create more community dialogue, more ability for government to manoeuvre. I think, the sort of command and control systems of the past are long gone. Gone is the time that government would just say to the community, this is good for you, and rush out and do it. Now we need a lot more community understanding and community engagement, and that only gets built in a dynamic partnership with activism. And yes, there's tension in that partnership. I know what it's like to be a policy maker and to think, gee, I've done so much in this area, and here's an activist coming into my door and saying, and we now want you to do this and this and this, and it's like, yeah, hang on, I've just done all of it. But even as I was feeling sort of a little world weary in that moment, I recognised that there was power in that creative tension, that those activists were out there creating more appetite for change that government can then help shape the delivery of. So we should never be afraid of broadening the partnerships, having dynamism around the data, making sure that the data speaks and motivates change, and that we moderate any of those tensions between us. We've all got a role to play if we're really going to strive for gender equality. We've got to have the people who are out there reaching for the moon, and then government saying, you know, we're coming along and doing those things that the community is now clearly more interested in and more ready for. Now, that doesn't mean that government can never play a leadership role. Government can and should play a leadership role too. But if there are more actors, then there's more ability to get the maximum amount of change.
Thank you for that, and thank you. You can applaud. Thank you for that. And partnerships is a tough one, but there is increasing trust in some of our spaces where it didn't exist before, and so there's got to be a willingness to try, I suppose, is the big thing. Alison, I come back to you now. Where are the greatest gaps, do you think, and what can we do about them?
Yeah, in terms of data gaps, that's something that's very real for the Equal Measures 2030 partnership. We've been combing the world, we've been combing all the data producers to find the very best data we can to compile in our index, but we did still confront some significant data gaps. So some examples, there's certain issues that we know advocates wanted us to include in the index that we couldn't really do justice on. So for example, we have an indicator around the legal framework for abortion, which is important. But what we don't have is an indicator that shows whether women really have access to that, even in countries where the laws on the books look good. So that's an example. A crucial one that we try and touch on is the gap, data gaps around different groups. So our index presents a national average. That does not mean by any stretch that the outcomes are the same for every group of girls and women in that country. We know that very well. And what I'd love to do is to look at what does our index look like for women with disabilities in that country. And unfortunately, the data is just not sufficiently disaggregated. There's also countries that are completely left out. And so many of the countries we weren't able to cover this time are those that are facing fragility and conflict. And we know that the data picture there for refugees, for internally displaced people, for women and girls caught in conflict, the data picture is often very much blank. Right. So there are gaps. We've done our best to compile what we can, and we'll keep building. We're updating the index every 2 years. So come to us, tell us what data we've missed. Let's hope we can keep building the picture more clearly every 2 years till 2030.
And this may continue evolving, so it's a process. It's a process. Ephraim, let me come to you now, and we've touched on partnerships. I'd like to understand, from your perspective, at community level, in the work that you do, where do you need stronger partnerships, and what would your call to those particular stakeholders be?
We need stronger partnerships in, first of all, with the government, because the government has a big role at community level, despite many times us thinking that community is so informal, but I actually think, as all books would say, that the community is actually the core of the government, the core of the community. The family, the community is the core of the government and the society. So we need a strong partnership. We need to have a clear link how the government, the different stakeholders can get down at the very, very rural and community groups. And I want to bring in something that the government needs to know, that every time they invest in gender disaggregated data, they actually have value for their money. And I will actually give a slightly different example, slightly away from healthcare, because I was recently doing some work on refugees, and Uganda has the largest number of refugees in Africa and the third largest in the world. And when you look at the refugee policy in Uganda, it's very robust and progressive, and it's been praised. But then when you come and start thinking about in that policy, the refugees are given land, they are given building materials. And recent reports have showed that a significant number of refugees don't have shelter, or they're living in substandard houses. In fact, in one of the districts, over 80% of the refugees are living in substandard houses. But when you ask yourself, okay, the government is giving people these building materials, what's happening? So it's until you get to this type of data that you start understanding what's the problem, that the majority of the refugees in most of the settings are women. Now, the Uganda's policy, which is actually good, gives you the building materials. But it forgets that in the communities where these women came from, their roles did not include construction of houses, did not include building, did not include some of these things. So you give somebody building materials and they cannot construct. So gender disaggregated data is very important in helping to monitor the progress of a community, how well it is progressing, and also to understand who is lagging behind. Is it which gender group is lagging behind? And really also to understand who is not benefiting from the investment you've made.
Right.
Yeah,
and why, perhaps, even delving further. And so, you know, it brings me to you, Gabriella. Perhaps you'd inspire us with a perspective. When this information comes in and is used efficiently, effectively, what kind of impact can we have? Paint a picture for us with one of your examples. What could the world be? How has the world changed with one of the projects maybe that you've worked on?
Well, let me just share this experience of how to inspire countries to allow men to take care of their children.
Okay.
So we always say, okay, let's do dual parental leave, and that's a policy, and then you go and measure how many countries that have the policy or not, and how. But that's not the point. The point is that you need to go further, not only to register who is having this right policy framework, but how do we do it? Because if you have dual parental leave, as I said, Korea has 1 year, nobody takes it, but then you have Canada who made enormous progress in terms of people taking it up. You need to build up the economic incentives. And that is important for the economic incentives. I can tell you in the United Kingdom, I was wondering why there was this trend, amazing trend of men taking parental leave, and Germany too. And everything had to do that men also are fearing for their career, not only the stigma, but their career in terms of taking a break and then going back to work. What they did was to say, okay, if you are a diplomat and you are in the foreign service, you are first, if you're a man and you take your parental leave, you are first to be promoted.
Wow.
Gosh, would you take your parental leave? Of course you take your parental leave. You don't need to convince anybody. Another beautiful example, so I'm promoting that kind of thing. It's not about just the data, it's just to say, look at the UK, they're fantastic. Look at Germany. Germany, what they did, they say, okay, guys, I'm going to give just this take it or leave it basis for men, take it or leave it basis for women. If both of you take your parental leave, you have 2 more months paid leave for both.
Wow.
Well, these are incentives that you say, okay, well, let's just move around with this issue. Another beautiful example, we're always talking about quotas and the Sigma quota, for God's sake. I mean, let's just see what works and what doesn't. And I think the Nordics had shown that well-designed quotas really work if you allow to have the pipeline for women and all these things. I went to Mexico. We did the quota for Congress, and we achieved 50-50%. Of course, the men were saying, oh, we're going to be full of incompetent women. I said, well, we're full of incompetent men without a quota. So what's the difference? We don't even know how many incompetent men we have because they don't come with the quota. In any case, what happened, beautiful example. Mexico, a very machist country, prime minister, now has 50-50 in the Congress. What do women do in the Congress? First, they were as productive as ever, the Congress, a little bit more. Second, they took decisions with gender lens. And now the Mexican Congress has passed a law for parity in government at the federal, municipal, and local level. That's a beautiful example, and nothing has suffered. I think it just goes on and on in terms of looking at how this helped. And then the self-confidence. This is something in the PISA report. Girls always report less self-confidence in maths and mathematics. We have programs also in many countries with the STEM, Niñas Puedes, and the digital to show that there are role models, that they can become an engineer, that they can build a robot. And this is also inspiring because we're gathering the evidence on how much these programs impact in the way we measure things.
Amazing, thank you. What wonderful examples. Brings us to the end of this particular panel. I want each of you to share with us, what will you do with your power? What's your commitment to the world and to yourself? And perhaps also, what would you challenge the rest of us to do with our power? Ephraim, I'll begin with you. What will you do with your power? And what challenge do you have for others, maybe?
What I'll do with my power is I will, in the community work that I do, I'll always endeavor to have a fair representation of both the gender groups. that you are doing work with in the community level, in the villages and in different community groups, so that the people are more satisfied with the care that you give them and that they do not need returning back. Okay. Now, I want to leave us with a simple message that there's no greater power than evidence. It's actually power, it's actually the evidence that has made people win decisions in courts and actually overturn other decisions. So as long as you invest in having evidence, then you'll definitely be very powerful.
Thank you very much for that. Amazing. Let me come to you, Alison, next.
Right. So I think how I'll use my power can be summed up with one quote from our partner, Groots Kenya, who might even be in the room. And Win Rose from Groots Kenya said, "When we have the facts, we are listened to." And so how I will use my power is to share tools like the Sdg Gender Index, but others, to ensure that all advocates and champions for gender equality have the facts so that they are also listened to.
Thank you so much for that. Gabriela?
Well, I will just continue doing what I do. I think that the OECD, I'm sorry, but the OECD put the issue in the G20 leaders table. I'm the Sherpa to the OECD. I was very proud that it was Australia Prime Minister who, for the very first time, put the gender issue. I can tell you, the Sherpa male said, "Gender issues for the leaders? Are you crazy?" And I said, "Give me 5 minutes." And the support, of course, of the Australians and the US and Canada and many other countries, and we managed to insert it there, is now in the leaders table. Why? Because we need to talk to men. We need to bring men to this conversation, and they need to understand that this is good business and this is good policies. I will continue working on changing the stereotyping with the Sdg Index and what I mentioned, the STEM Niñas Pueden. And something that I'm very concerned about, and I'm really going to be looking into gathering the evidence, is the impact of the media, the impact of social networks, the impact of all this stereotyping. We're, as I said, always rowing against the, we build all these amazing policies, and then you turn off the TV or you turn off the music, and the stereotyping is just there on your face. So I think that we really need to evidence how much this harms people. And finally, get more with the more difficult parts to measure. Violence against women, helping leaders like Kailash Satyarthi to stop girls trafficking. All these things that are so difficult to measure, but what we need to do to really advance a much better world for men and women.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your work and for continuing to be a champion. You have the final word on this panel, Julia. How will you use your power, and what's your message for everyone else?
Thank you, and I think that's a fantastic reminder that a gender equal world will be better for men and for women. And in that context, I want to use my power to keep shining a spotlight on the lack of educational opportunity for the poorest and most marginalised girls. And I want to use my power to be getting the evidence that will help us break down the barriers that stop women becoming leaders. If we've got more women leading, then we'll have more merit, because merit's equally distributed between the sexes. So if we are in an unequal world, then the best people aren't getting to lead. And if we have women around those decision-making tables, then the decisions that are made for the future of women and girls will be better decisions.
Thank you so much. A big round of applause, please, for this panel. Julia has said it's about shining a spotlight on the key issues, and I think she highlighted education and leadership as being two of those. We've been warned that we need to get evidence on, for instance, stereotypes and how they're impacting on us, on social media and on the media. Alison has said, when we have the facts, we are listened to, and that's absolutely key. And Ephraim tells us there's no greater power than evidence. Asante sana. Thank you very, very much. And we may excuse this panel, and let me welcome the next panel to come out now. Thank you. Thank you. And we continue with our focus. Yeah, the chair's making some interesting sounds there. We continue with our focus on data, and this time now we look at accountability as a key issue. We have a great panel with us. Right next to me is the UN Envoy on Youth, Jayathma Ramanayake.
Good job.
Oh, good job, she says. Thank you. And next to her, we're happy to have Aparajita Gogoi from the White Ribbon Alliance.
Okay.
Right next to her is Osvaldo Christian Rudloff Polgar, Head of Cooperation and International Affairs at the Controller General Office of Chile. Thank you for being with us. And right next to him is Joy Pumapi, co-chair of the UN Secretary General's Independent Accountability Panel for Every Woman, Every Child. Thank you for making time to discuss accountability with us. And Jayathma, I think I'll start with you. And the importance of young people engaging and how they engage with data to, number one, make their voices heard, which is critical. Number two, to drive the change that they hope to see. Please take us through that.
Thank you, Julie. I think we need to flip that question. Instead of asking how young people are using data or how young people are using data for accountability, we need to see what data is available for young people to use, or what data is available for young people to use for their advocacy or to drive change. I sometimes make a joke that if there was an 18th goal in the Sustainable Development Goals, it would be youth. But the truth is that we don't, and I see young people reflected pretty much in all 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Either it's about poverty, education, employment, climate, so on and so forth. But when I started my job as the UN Secretary General's Envoy on Youth, one of the exercises that I wanted to do was to see how across these 17 Sustainable Development Goals, young people's lives are reflected. How are we delivering for young people instead of asking young people to deliver for us? And when I saw the indicators, there are about 64 indicators that are directly relevant to young people's lives. So we started pulling in data from the demographic health surveys, from the data that the government has submitted to through the statistical commissions. But voila, we didn't find much. That is because the data we have currently are not disaggregated by age. Majority of the data that we have now are not disaggregated by age. So we had data sets from 0 to 15 years and 15 to 60 years or 15 to 49 years. So there was no way for us to see how the SDGs are impacting the lives of young people between 15 to 29 years or 15 to 35 years. So this is a huge gap. So I think that's why, building on what Gabriela said, like measure what you treasure, there's a lot of talk about young people. Oh, youth are the leaders of today, the future, and we talk about young people, but are we putting our money where our mouth is? Right. Are we investing in actually collecting the stories and data and evidence of young people's lives to inform our decisions, whether they are policies or programs? Because for me, progress overall doesn't mean progress for all, right? If we say that, say, the number of access to education has increased over the number of years, but if the number of out-of-school girls has increased in the last 2 years, that's not progress for all. Right. If we say food security indicators are doing well, but if young women and girls are the last persons to eat in their families, and they're the ones who get the least amount of food in their families, that's not progress for all. And if we say the amount of education funding has increased over the last few years, but still in our schools in Palestine is suffering from education, funding for education, then that's not progress for all. That might be progress overall, but not for all. So I think we need to keep looking very carefully at how we are treating for or delivering for young people within the context of SDGs and put really our money where our mouth is.
Thank you for that. So, we need to analyze what, you may clap, go ahead, please. We need to analyze what data is available for young people to use, and progress overall does not mean progress for all. And you bring us back to the fact that even as we're discussing gender disaggregated data, we still need better data across other variables. Exactly. and age is one of them. So Parajita, let me come to you next. And you for a long time have been working on amplifying women's voices and translating that into impact. This is being done through strong advocacy agendas on the ground in India. Take us through some examples of the work you've done and the impact that it has had in creating accountability and transformation.
Thank you for the question. I think, first off, we do need to acknowledge that there are progress happening. Of course, when it comes to women's sexual and reproductive health rights, it's sometimes one step forward and two steps backwards. But I come from a country which has performed pretty well in the last decade or so. Our decline in maternal mortality is faster than the global decline. Number of women who started going to facilities for childbirth is over 80%. So there's a lot of good news. But however, people like us practitioners know that the last mile is usually the toughest. And at White Ribbon India, which is a coalition, we belong to a global coalition of thousands of organizations who exist to ensure that women's health rights are heard and respected and acted upon. Incidentally, this is the 20th year of the Alliance, so we have a time to look back. I think I can ask people to clap for that.
Yes,
20 years.
absolutely.
Thank you for that. So we were sitting and looking at, how do we get across to the last line? And what we realized was something big was missing, and that was really voices of women. I think though our intentions are good across sectors, across levels, we look at women like recipient, passive recipient, but not really running the conversation, not giving the direction. So we sat and conceived of this campaign called What Women Want. When we started, it was an idea. It grew organically. But the simple but very powerful idea was that we will go out and ask women to put down their one ask, their top demand. What is it that the rest of us need to deliver to meet her topmost demand? This campaign grew very quickly. In 2017, we wanted just about to hear from 50,000 women. In 3 months, we had 150,000 women writing to us, filling up the postcards. We were inundated with women's asks. We sat, we analyzed, we looked at the data. The previous panel was on the data. And what we learned was just presenting the data is just not enough. You have to translate the data. You have to translate the data into actionable actions that powerful people can take. So we looked at what women had asked for. We created Charter of Demands. And what we did with this advocacy agenda really was to ensure that these women's voices were used to ask for commitment, to ask for investment, and to ask for accountability. So that's an example of how we do ground-up advocacy and really try and connect voices of women and communities to systems and to policymakers and to practitioners and to advocates.
Very well done. Thank you very much for that example. And well done on achieving 3 times the number of the expected responses. Amazing.
Well, this year, it's a global campaign, and the results are going to be shared tonight, and we have reached 1.2 million women worldwide.
Oh, that needs a round of applause. Well done. Well done.
Thank you.
Osvaldo, let me come to you now, and let's look at some tools. So when we look at gender analysis, budgeting, and audits, they are 3 connected tools which can be effective in furthering a more gender-equal world. Take us through your thoughts on this and how you're working with those tools to shift things.
Okay. Yeah, well, buenos dias, bonjour. Good morning, you all. I'm here representing a regional organization of Latin America and the Caribbean of Auditor Generals. Offices that make the governments accountable. And one of the products we have are the coordinated audits. A coordinated audit is an audit in which different audit institutions define a common topic, a common schedule, and a common procedure to make this audit, to carry on this audit. And at the end, we present the results in a consolidated report. In a second activity regarding auditing gender, in 2016 we started an audit focused on the how the governments are preparing for the implementation of SDG 5 along our countries in Latin America, the Caribbean, and also Spain. We invited Spain to participate in this audit. And we found that when we carried out this audit, we found that there are interesting results in different aspects. If you ask me about funding, probably funding is in where governments are doing worst.
Wow.
Yeah. We analyzed 3 main aspects: the planning, how they're planning and incorporating SDGs at the national level, funding, and also the follow-up process. The first, planning and follow-up, they are doing well. but in the case of funding, they're not doing quite well in general. In fact, under the system we create, they are in an early development moment because they have a lot of things to do to improve what they're doing regarding budgeting in general. What we analyze in this aspect, when at the first attempt we take a look on if government has or not structures to face challenges regarding funding to implement SDG 5. They have it. That's great.
Okay.
But that's very common in Latin America. We always have institutions, we always have procedures, we have everything
And then what
to
happens?
show it. And then what happens?
Yeah.
The enforcement, that's the problem. Because when we go into depth, there is no, for example, in our audit, one of the findings is that there is no evidence of the performance of a mid-long-term need assessment. So the governments say they are working to implement SDG 5, but they don't know what they need to do it. And in the case of those governments that already made a needs assessment, they don't have any tool to evaluate the impact. So probably they have policies, they have actions, they have institutions, but they don't know if those things they have are helping them to achieve the goals of the SDG 5.
Right. Let me just pose this question to everybody here. You know, whether we call it enforcement or implementation, in many of our spaces, there's that gap. We have a lot of things in place, and then it just, when it comes to the action, how many people feel that is happening in their spaces? Would you put your hands up if you feel that either enforcement, right up, if you feel enforcement or implementation is an end, and there are a few hands that have gone up. Yes, it's a common problem, not just in your region, I think. Joy, let me come to you now, and you have a special focus on vulnerable girls. You speak, some people say, for those who don't have power. I don't know how you view it. Maybe you have a different perspective. For those whose voices are not very often heard. Tell us how you engage with data. How do you use it to have impact?
Thank you very much. What we believe is that nobody can speak for somebody better than that person themselves. Right. So, and we believe that data is part of the voice of the people. Okay. Data belongs to the people. It does not belong to the government. It does not belong to the organization. Any data that you collect that about people belongs to the people that you are collecting the data on about. And we believe, therefore, that in order for you to actually motivate action, to get the full voice of the people, you take the data, you engage the people, and together, collectively, that data and the people formulate the evidence that is going to motivate policy, the regulatory environment, design the program, monitor the effectiveness of the program, and also tell you, inform you on what to act, and whether that act is actually a remedy that action is a remedy that is addressing the needs of the people. So we believe that that is what formulates accountability. Accountability is about the responsibility that you have assumed. The moment you become a Minister of Health, Minister of Education, you are accountable for the education and for the health of all the people of that country. Just simply by assuming that position. The moment you become the manager of a food manufacturing company, you are accountable for the quality of the food that company produces and the extent to which it meets the needs that you said you will provide to the people. Right. So that's where we think accountability is. And data is a tool and a part of the voice of the people, but it has to come with the evidence that the people themselves provide.
I love that. So it empowers the people. Yes. That's where we begin. That's where we begin. Let me come back to the youth perspective now. And you kind of threw a spanner in my works. I have to shift my questions now. You know, because you did say to us at the beginning, you know, we've got to ask ourselves first and foremost, what kind of data do we have? Is it good enough? Let me ask you this question now. What would you advise young people? It would be great to have the ideal data, but right now, clearly there are challenges. What would you advise young people in order to move the agenda forward? How can they use their power to ensure they're getting the kind of data they need and therefore are able to hold leadership accountable?
I mean, young people are always a step or two ahead of us than we think. So young people, youth organizations all over the world were not just waiting for us to find ways, for them to be involved. So there are already some really great things that are happening on the ground. Perhaps I can share as some examples than advice, because I don't think the young people need my advice. I think there are two parts to that question, Julie. The first one is about how we use data for accountability or data collection for accountability, and the other part is the accountability in data collection processes itself. So in terms of using data for accountability, a lot of the youth organizations around the world are using the little available data very creatively through advocacy campaigns, through mobilization activities, to push and pressure policymakers to do better, not just on issues or areas that matter to the lives of young people, but matters to all of us living on this planet. So some of these available data or evidence are being used to debunk and break some of the myths and misconceptions that we have about young people's lives. For an example, there's this popular belief that when youth unemployment is high, violence is going to be higher. Now, what data actually shows us is that there is no correlation between youth unemployment and violence. Or there's this popular myth that whenever there's more young people living in a country, we call it a youth bulge, that there is a high risk of violence or conflict. But what actual data shows us is that there's no correlation between the number of young people and the violence.
Can we give those two a round of applause? Can we just recognize those two?
So young people are using these in very creative ways through campaigns, through advocacy, to debunk these myths and actually tell the truth about young people's lives. And then also they use the available data and data they collect in their communities to write, for an example, shadow reports. There are youth-led organizations, young feminist organizations who do shadow reporting to the CEDAW, to the Human Rights Council, sometimes even on the Sustainable Development Goals. There are youth organizations, for an example, the National Youth Council of Netherlands wrote an entire chapter of their country's voluntary national review. So there are ways that young people are using the available limited data in creative ways to influence decisions and hold policymakers accountable. And on the other side of the accountability of data collection processes, young people are also leading initiatives on the ground to actually collect data. So for an example, the Girl Guides, the World Association of Girl Guides and Girl Scouts, use something called U-Report, where they use text messages to collect data from girls in communities that might not otherwise be reached by policymakers or big organizations. There are scouts who goes into the most rural areas of the world and go meet communities, speak in their language, and collect data about their communities. For an example, student volunteer organizations like ISAC, for an example, when the members of ISAC goes for volunteering opportunities, they log their numbers of hours they volunteer under each of the SDGs, so keep track of how much their organization is contributing to the achievement of SDGs. So there are these different approaches. There's also citizen journalism, where young people record if the health center in their community is not working, they would record it and sort of use social media as a tool to then let the policymakers know, let the ministers know, let the authorities know that they're not really receiving the benefits of the Sustainable Development Agenda. So there are multiple ways that young people are using their power to use best use of the available data, but also use it in a creative way to get the attention and the commitment from policymakers.
Thank you. That's really inspirational, and thank you for debunking those stereotypes. I think in the last panel session, we did highlight stereotypes as one of the dangers that we really do need to deal with. Let me come to you, Aparajita, once again. And you did talk about the campaign. You talked us through it, the experience. Of course, later this evening, you've told us there will be an announcement. What are your hopes and what is your vision for this campaign this time round? And maybe how can we all play a bigger role?
This campaign went very wide. It went very deep. It went and spoke to women where they are. It almost spoke to one woman at a time. And I think we now are holding ourselves accountable to really making these voices heard. What we collected is more than just data. It's voices of women, it's their hope, it's their aspiration, it's their demand, and it's their right. And I think it's time for us to kind of deliver on that. So the first thing that we are doing right now is really looking at disaggregating the voices, because women are not equal everywhere. Even in my country, different women in different geographies have asked for different things. So I think it's really, really important to localize women's voices so that we can push for action at various levels. The first thing we did was that, disaggregate, understand why are women asking for what, and what works, what will work in a particular geographic setting or a sectoral setting. The second thing that we are trying to do, and we did in India, was really to back up women's voices by research and advocacy. And I'll give you an example. The highest ask in 2017 in India was, you must do away with disrespect and abuse when it comes to childbirth, when women go to facilities. It wasn't enough for us just to say that zero tolerance for disrespect and abuse. We had to take a step back and figure out, where is this happening? Why are women being treated badly? Who are the people that we can go to? For example, the government. The all-powerful government can kind of institute some of these changes. So it really meant that we had to go back and look at finding more about, doing research, looking at advocacy partners, opportunities. So that's the second thing that we did and we will do. And the third thing really is to reach out to people with power so that they deliver on what women are asking for. So for example, if it's a local kind of, let's say, member of parliament, Women's Charter of Demands is very specific for with regards to what that particular member of parliament can do. For example, donate an ambulance or ambulances from the local area development fund, or ensure that health functionaries are there on time or facilities are working. But when it comes to national level, obviously we have a separate set of demand that we take to the health minister, which is much more larger. Right. So what we intend doing is really breaking out the global data, the national data, the subnational data, so that, like I said, we hold ourselves accountable to delivering on what women have asked for.
Well done, and thank you for that. Joy, brings me to you now. And let's look at organizations now and ask ourselves, how can they utilize data to create a culture of accountability that drives change? And then a second part to that question, how can we work better together? A lot of our challenges today really need multi-stakeholder participation. How can we work better as partners? Those two, please.
I think just to build on what the other panelists have been saying about the importance of disaggregating the data, but also the importance of knowing where the people are that you are targeting, with policies, with programs. That is extremely important. So one of our biggest weaknesses in developing countries is that the civil registration is very poor. So the CRVS is very, very important. That is what informs government, it informs companies. First of all, about the age distribution, where everybody is that needs to be targeted with services and that need to benefit from the programs that have been developed. So for me, that is the first thing. And what is absolutely critical is that when you come in as a development partner or as an organization, you come into a country, you need to base your intervention and your engagement on the country's plans and strategies, and you build onto the system. Now, what happens is that we have a tendency as development partners, because we feel that the data that is being collected is weak, of coming in with our own data collection systems, and we collect our own data that is relevant for our own programs, and we do nothing to actually strengthen existing systems and make sure that we have an integrated program where relevant data is being collected that is relevant to the needs of the people, not relevant to the demands of the donor. So it is extremely important that all of us as development partners, when we go into a country, we work together and we agree that we are coordinated by the government. but that all the data that is collected is relevant to the needs, to the disaggregated population status of that particular country, according to age, according to sex, and according to sometimes even ethnic groupings, because sometimes the indigenous populations are left behind, and according to geographic location, so that we can be able to know where we should target our programs. And when we develop an accountability mechanism, that accountability mechanism should listen to the people, so that we collect the data, yes, but when we review the data, we must call the people to the table. A woman might not be going to the clinic not because the clinic is far from her, but maybe because she's overwhelmed. Maybe there's a day when she's supposed to go there for antenatal care. There's a day when she's supposed to go there to take her sixth child. There's a day when she's supposed to go for vaccination. So the woman might prefer to be able to do all three of these things in one day, because she's the main breadwinner in the family. So listening to the people, collecting all the evidence, and designing programs in an integrated fashion in order to suit the demands of the people. Young people might not be going for family planning and reproductive and healthcare services, which are supposed to be youth-friendly, because those are housed in the same place as where their mothers go, where their aunts go.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So it is absolutely critical that we listen to the young people and understand what their needs are, so that we can design the services that suit them best.
Thank you so much for that. And I think, that does take a lot of mindset change. And for some organizations, they've got to just take that journey. Osvaldo, I come back to you now. And let's look at audit institutions, supreme audit institutions, or offices that hold government accountable, for instance. Take us through the role of these offices and take us through how you engage with stakeholders to lead by example when it comes to accountability. What is best practice in this world?
Okay, probably the main word in this case is accountability. On the one hand, we have been working with civil society for a long time at a regional level, Latin America and the Caribbean. For us, civil society and other stakeholders are key stakeholders that can help us to make our reports more available. And the idea for us is to work with civil society in a partnership. So we prepare it, we make an audit, we present a report, and we give this report to civil society, and then they can use this report as a tool, as an advocating tool, to make the government accountable. So that's the idea. We don't have all the power. We can go and take a look on how the government is doing, if they are doing well their job, but if not, we present this in a report and give it to civil society, and then can go and ask the government, why are you doing this, and why are you not doing this? Look at what the audit report's saying. Why are you doing this bad? What can you do better? That's the idea of our job in general. And if you said, leading by the example, along with this audit we carried out this last year, we also carried an internal survey along the whole continent to know how we're doing in our audit institutions with gender-related issues. It was a huge survey. We received more than 4,000 answers of officers from audit institutions. And, well, the results are better than what we thought, but they are really bad. #honestly. But they are really, really bad. But not really, really bad.
So what is the way forward?
That's the point. Now we have data. Now we have information of where are we standing now. So we are able to tell to the head of our institutions, well, we need to do something because we have some problems about language, about procedures for sexual harassment, and other topics. Right. But that's the important thing. We have information to share with the head of our institutions to make changes, and also information for civil society to make the governments accountable.
Thank you. And I think we're connecting dots because in the earlier panel, Julia Gillard just did tell us about the power of using shame to transform and lobbying and working with partners such as civil society to really get the message across and move people forward. As we close this panel, would you please share with us what you're going to do with your power? And if you have a message for other stakeholders on how they can rise up as well, what would your message be? I think, Joy, let me begin with you on the end.
The strongest power that I have is working with heads of state and government, making sure that you actually hold them accountable by giving voice to the people.
Right.
And giving voice to the people, by giving voice to the people, I mean, there is no value in having an accountability mechanism that just targets the politician, the head of state, the company. And when the people that are being served do not have access to that information and do not know whether their needs are being met or not. I mean, I find it quite surprising that we have a lot of partners who will come and report to you that we have provided this service to 2 million people, 20 million people, and they assume that those people are happy with the service, their needs have been met. But if you go back to those people and find to find out whether their needs have been met, whether they are happy, they'll tell you no, they are not.
Right.
So I believe that the power is in empowering people with information, making information and data particularly in a manner that is easy to understand and that it can be consumed by the population, available to everybody. Mm-hmm. So that is how to empower people, and that is the power that I'm going to focus on sharing.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you. Osvaldo.
Well, let's think in a Batman and Robin film. Probably the government will be Batman. It's the guy in charge, who is the guy who have to move forward for the implementation of SDG 5. And we're Robin. We're always looking, giving Batman advice and support, and making him accountable. So if we think in SDG 5 as a wagon, for example, the government is in charge of pulling it, and our power is to push it. We're coming from behind and pushing the wagon to go straight on the good pattern.
Can we say that's SDG 17 partnerships?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Parajita, please.
Women are often reduced to numbers of girls who finished 12 years of education, number of girls who got full antenatal care, number of women who delivered in hospitals. But I think with whatever power I have, what I will try to do with my friends and networks is really prevent women from being this nameless, faceless, voiceless being, and not be reduced to numbers, but really be a voice to be reckoned with. So 1.2 million women have spoken, and what I will do is really ensure that we take these voices to places where it matters and push for action, commitment, and investment.
Wow, so powerful. Thank you so much. And our youth voice gets the final word. Jayathma, over to you.
We have 1 more minute. Can I use that to give 3 messages?
3? Well, yes.
So as you asked also, what is the message to stakeholders? Number 1 would be, please invest in age desegregated data. Young people, especially young women and girls, young LGBTIQ people face extra layers of discrimination. We need to know how we are working for them. So please invest in age desegregated data. Number 2, please use the platforms that young people are offering for you. If you look at the youth organizations, the informal networks of young people, the Scouts, Girl Guides, these are 50 million, 52 million strong youth-led community organizations. In your countries, you won't be able to find 1,000, 2,000. It's not going to be hard to find 1,000, 2,000 volunteers who can help government institutions, who can help civil society institutions through their networks to go into communities and collect the data that you're missing. So use the power that young people are offering to you. And number 3, building on what Joy said, accountability is not about governments being accountable to themselves or governments being accountable to the other governments or donors. It's about being accountable to people. So democratize data collection processes, democratize data analysis processes, involve people in making decisions about data, involve people in collection data, involve people in analyzing data. And when I say people, I mean especially young people, because they need to have ownership to drive the sustainable development and agenda, and ownership can only come if you meaningfully include them in these processes. And my power, I will use my power to empower others, because I think the value of power is only if you share it with other people. And by empowering others, I don't mean empowering women or young people. It is to empower our leaders. I think our leaders also need to be empowered in a way for them to be innovative and creative in the way they're thinking, and for them to be reminded that sometimes they're leaving other groups behind when they're leading. So I will use my power to empower the UN Secretary General, the heads of the UN agencies, the ministers, head of states that I work with, to make sure that they keep young people, especially young women and girls, in the front and center of the work that they do.
Thank you. Thank you. I feel incredibly inspired by the whole panel. Just to recap, we've been told democratize data processes, use the power that young people are offering you, and invest in age disaggregated data. I think that's a very important thing to take away from this discussion. It wasn't the focus, but certainly is a key aspect. Prevent women from being nameless, faceless, and voiceless beings. Such a powerful statement. Take their voices to places where a difference will be made, is what I heard you saying. Osvaldo says, we need a Batman and Robin approach. So if government is Batman, we're there backing him up and really working together to bring transformation and change. And finally, Joy says, hold government accountable by giving voice to the people, but also empower people with information and data in a way that they understand it. A warm round of applause, please, for this incredible panel. Thank you all very, very much. It's been an absolute pleasure and an honor, and we can exit the stage. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Welcome to the stage, Her Excellency, the President of Ethiopia, Sahle-Work Zewde.
Oops. Good afternoon. I'm happy to be back here. Unfortunately, I couldn't attend the panels, the two panels that have preceded, the data on data and accountability. Usually when you conclude a panel, it means that you gather the wisdom from all the speakers and conclude by pretending that the wisdom is yours at the end of the day. Unfortunately, I didn't listen to the panel, so whatever I say will be mine, but I'm sure that we all be agreeing on the conclusions. This is a very critical issue that affects all of us. You have said it the whole day. My own experience has taught me that numbers and data can be really both negative and positive, and that it can be a vital tool or instead a weapon. A little over a week ago, we had in Addis Ababa a meeting on child and hunger. It was a very important meeting dealing with the situation of African child and hunger. One of the major issues that we discussed was the importance of data and accurate and contextual analysis of the data. What I took away from this important gathering of largely, I must say, African experts on the issue of child rights is the power of representation and production of contextual data. We need to understand and question the standards and frameworks we use to determine best practices, We need to engage local communities in everything we do. A few points. Good intentions need to be backed by good data. Because without accurate data and a system of accountability, all our good intentions and hard work could turn out to be fruitless. Good data is also inclusive and representative. We do all care. We want to build societies with equity and justice. We have ideas on what needs to happen in order for us to lift women out of poverty, abuse, and exclusion. But all of these good intentions need to be rooted in accurate, reliable, and representative data of what is happening at the moment. When you diagnose something well, then you can be sure that you will find the right cure or the right medicine. When you know something inside out, change can become fairly simple. Data, by the way, is another word for information. When it is accurate and representative, it has the power to replace dangerous stereotypes with a more accurate picture. That can mean the difference between life and death in some circumstances. At this age of technology, we are given the impression that the findings reported for all objective and scientific and is equated with fact. But I'm here to ask how representatives are the rooms in which these decisions are taken or are made. How inclusive are the software we design? How are the biggest research labs and IT companies training their artificial intelligence software? Are we sure that we are not going to learn that the data we are using today will not have unintended consequences of stereotyping and exclusion? We now know better than to repeat these mistakes. This is a serious concern for Africa because we have a long way to go before we can bridge the digital gap and meaningfully contribute to the global conversation and data. Gender and the inclusion of women in research of the data is often an afterthought. This has to change. It's unacceptable to continue misrepresenting women's status, roles, and needs, or designing programs without taking into account the complex challenges women face. Gender disaggregated data is changing the way we even understood the problems. For example, in agriculture, it's only recently that governments and organizations are designing with the women farmers in mind. All policy interventions catered to men because it was conventionally assumed that women are not real farmers and that they only helped out on field. But now we understand that in addition to taking care of household work, women undertake significant amounts of farm work. And if they received structural support and policy and legal protection, they could lift their families out of poverty. Even with this knowledge, the data collected on the effectiveness of these policies and programs are often done by interviewing male farmers, since women are often not invited to or allowed to attend due to social norm barriers, discussions on farming, and access to resources and services. This means that female-headed households, wives who are trying to learn new ways of growing crops, get access to finance, will not do so because they are excluded from starting their planning stage of these interventions. Few words on accountability. From my own experience in leadership and public service, I can tell you that accountability dies in the fog of ambiguous rules and procedures and processes. Clarity is really essential, is key to ensuring accountability. Everyone has an agenda with how they collect and use data. It can be a political and indeed a controversial process. We know that it has been used against nations, groups of people in many instances. That is why we need to empower governments, civil society, and academic institutions to produce resources and data on various issues so that they can hold each other accountable. We need all of them to be up to standard and provide clear standards, tools, and numbers so that the public is always served best. As I always say, none of us achieve this goal of building a gender-equal world on our own. We need, indeed, to collaborate. Not because it would be a nice thing to do, because it's absolutely necessary. When different groups, sectors, and stakeholders are on the same page, we all move forward. Collaboration should never mean that one sector silences the other. It should be done with the understanding that we are here to hold each other accountable. That is how functional systems are built. As I conclude, in the spirit of this conference in general and the panels that you have heard in particular, I would like to commit to be an advocate for accountability, generation of more and gender disaggregated data in all sectors, and to use my power and platform to be a voice for gender equality and underrepresented and excluded women everywhere. Thank you very much for your attention.
This concludes our morning sessions. We ask all delegates to exit the plenary hall and please bring your belongings with you. Lunch will be served in the fueling station and in lunch sessions.